Please welcome Kelli and Cullen.
Do I use this here?
I think
Do
so.
we use this here? Okay. Can y'all hear me? Okay. Okay. I'm not a very loud speaker, so try to speak into the microphone. So I'm Cullen, and this is my wife, Kelli. And like they said, we're going to be speaking about our roles with natural resources management in two very different sized cities, and actually they are adjacent cities. So we'll go ahead and see if we can get into this. So when you look up Pearland on the internet, it says we're a little over 113,000 people. Our city actually estimates we're more like 125,000 now. It's really growing. You can see on the map we're the little tan area there. It looks tiny compared to the big purple area up there. But I am in the parks department there in Pearland, and so we have about 19 parks in our park system, and that includes, small neighborhood parks. We have sports complexes, but we do also have 2 parks that are primarily dedicated as natural area parks. And those 2 parks are about 110 acres total, so I'll talk a little bit more about those. So I've been with the city about a year now, right at a year. The Natural Resources Division was actually created in the Parks Department about a year and a half ago. So it's still a pretty new program that we've got there in Pearland. So a lot of the things that I'm talking about are really just getting going and just getting underway. So when Kelli talks about hers, you'll see hers are a little bit further along than some of the stuff that we're doing. So I am the Natural Resources Manager for Pearland in the Parks Department, and then we have, in our division, we also have an urban forester and an outdoor recreation programmer. So that's what makes up our Natural Resources Division.
I'm also with the Parks Department for the City of Houston, and the population for Houston is about 2.3 million, and we have 374 parks right now, and we've done some inventory to try and figure out how much natural area we have within these parks. There's a lot of land in some of these parks. There was an intern that, through the Natural Resources Program, that went through and looked at all of the undeveloped land within parks. And so aerially, we have an estimate that approximately 75 of the 374 parks have natural areas of greater than 1 acre, and that's varying habitats. And that's about 15,000 acres. And so we have a couple of those parks that are very large. Lake Houston Wilderness Park is almost 5,000 of that. Cullen Park is a lease through the Army Corps of Engineers, and that's around 9,000. So we have a couple of these really big areas, and then I'll talk about some of our other sites that are really varying in size that we're doing some restoration at. But there's a lot of different parks and a lot of opportunity to do all kinds of restoration and research on some of these parks and dealing with natural resources. So Cullen has a natural resources division. Houston has a natural resources program. We're not a division, so we're under quality assurance division, and that's a little bit different. And our forestry department is a division, and it's unrelated to natural resources. So Cullen is over forestry. He's over the forester, and there's one forester for Pearland. But Houston we have a bunch of foresters, and it's a whole division, and it's separate from natural resources, which can be a little bit tricky because forestry is actually a component of natural resources. So communication between the two sometimes is a little bit difficult because they have their own projects and I have mine, and they both have to do with trees, sometimes. So that's a little bit tricky, but we have a great forestry department, and they're really open to native plants and things that I'm interested in restoration. So that makes it a little bit easier.
So like we mentioned, Pearland, the Natural Resource Division, is our own separate division within the Parks Department. So with that, we have our actual budget that we actually have to operate out of. So, and while it's not, millions of dollars or anything like that, just having an operating budget, knowing what you have to work with, makes it a lot easier for planning projects and trying to figure out what you want to do with your money. Mentioned in our kind of intro, we've worked at a lot of nonprofit nonprofits and for the state. And so it's a little bit different there where, you know, you're kind of going by what you can get through grants mostly. So you may not know necessarily one year to the next what exactly you have to work with. So that's been a big change for me, is having that steady source of money to do these projects with. Being a city municipality, we do try to be as financially responsible as we can, since we are using, you know, taxpayers' money for some of this stuff. So we do try to get grants where we can to help support our projects and make what we do get able to stretch a little bit further. And then we also are allowed to accept donations through our Parks Foundation. So people oftentimes ask, you know, we want to make a contribution for natural resources in Pearland. How can we do that? So there is a way to be able to earmark it for natural resource work and what we're doing.
For our program, most of our program is grant funded. My salary is paid, and you know, we drive city vehicles and all of that type of thing is paid for. But as far as getting our projects done, most of that is through grants, which is okay with me because Cullen mentioned that, you know, we both worked at Armand Bayou Nature Center. I funded my position at Armand Bayou Nature Center through grants. I like writing grants, and we've been pretty successful with getting grants for the Natural Resources Program. So I'll talk about some of my grants earlier, but most of our project money is grant funded, and it's easy to use. Since my salary is paid for with the city, it's easy to use my salary as match for some of these grants, and travel, and so since we do have the vehicle, so that when I do write a grant, all I have to focus on is that project and getting money to do the project, and I don't have to worry about paying for myself. So that works out well. The city does pay for things. You know, if I need something that isn't tied to a specific project, a lot of times with our propagation program, I'll need soil and stuff like that. So the city will pay for those things, and we can also take donations.
All right, so when I started with Pearland, I said, you know, I asked my supervisor, well, what is the natural resources, you know, manager supposed to be doing? And he pretty much told me, whatever you want to do. And so I said, well, I know what I want to do. And so restoration and habitat enhancement has been kind of my primary focus of what I'm working towards. I'm showing this picture up here. This is what we call the Shadow Creek Ranch Nature Trail. It's about a 40 acre park, and it's kind of interesting how we got this land. There's a really large development off of 288 that's called Shadow Creek. And so in Pearland, whenever there's a development that comes in, they have to do what's called parkland dedication. So it's basically, there's been research done, and there's formulas that say every person that lives in the city impacts the park system by this amount of dollars. So there's actually a number attached to it. So from that, we say, well, if y'all are creating this many homes, we have to be able to accommodate this many people in our park system. And so they can either, money goes towards the maintenance of our parks, or they can donate land for future parks. And so in this case, they actually donated this land, and it was dedicated as our kind of natural area park. There's also about 14 acres of wetlands on it I was told it was done, they created those as part of their mitigation requirements for their development. But the wetlands are actually in really good shape. There's a lot of really cool native plants in there. The only issue there is a little bit of cattail getting out of control. I know it's a native plant as well, but in these shallow wetlands like that, they can be a problem sometimes. So I'll probably have to do a little bit of cattail control there. I put this kind of historical picture up here to show you when I started looking at this site and figuring out what I wanted to do out here. You can see from the 1940s, you know, everyone knows you can rewind the Google Earth. That's a really useful tool. And it goes back to the 40s for the Houston area. And so from that, you're able to see a lot of, on the eastern portion of the park, a lot of the features that would have been consistent with coastal prairies, like the Mima Mountains and all of that. In the western half, you can see all the levees going through there, so it was probably being farmed at the time of this picture. But that eastern half gave me a really good clue as to what I should be trying to do out there. So I have this area outlined in red. That's about 10 acres, and that's where I'm doing a prairie restoration project. So after they quit farming it and the city took over, you know, they kind of said, well, it's a natural area. We just leave it alone. So whenever they left it alone, of course, our friend Chinese tallow grew up everywhere. So that's been kind of the first step of this project is removing the tallow. I'll show you.
Clear Creek?
That is Clear Creek that's running along the north side there. And this is,
So did Harvey get it?
so sorry?
Did Harvey get that?
It flooded, but there wasn't really damage. You know, that's what these areas are designed for, to hold water, and they can recover. They're pretty resilient. But this is, if you're familiar with the area, this is Kingsley, and then Kirby is just on the other side right there. So I mentioned how we try to be as fiscally responsible as we can. So whenever looking at this project and starting to figure out how to get rid of all the tallow, there was about 6 acres that was pretty much covered in tallow there. I had some contractors come and look and give me quotes of what it would cost for them to do the hydroaxing, and it was something like $50,000 around there. I actually wound up, there's right up the road, about half a mile from the park, is a Bobcat of Houston. So I was able to rent this machine for $3,000 for the week and do it all myself. So with that, of course, there's going to be a lot of tallow coming back up. So the next step is this spring and summer focusing on invasive control. So we'll be doing some herbicide treatments out there to try and get those under control before we start seeding. I did mention how we try to partner and we look for grants. So actually on this project, we're able to partner with Monarch Gateway, who has partnered with Houston Wilderness on a grant to create monarch habitat. And since Prairie is our monarch habitat, they're able to help contribute money towards this project. So that's been a big help for funding some of this prep work that we're doing.
Are you going to do a controlled burn there?
So it's funny you mentioned that. In my interview, they took me to this site and said, "What would you do here?" And I told them, don't think I'm crazy, but probably the best thing you could do is set fire to it. And they kind of were like, "Well, I don't know about that." There's actually, I don't know if we can.
Well, there's always accidental fires happening all over.
Yeah. So there's actually, and this doesn't show it, but so this is apartment complexes here, and there's actually another one right here now, and they're getting ready to develop this area up there. So I think I was pretty much told, it doesn't hurt to ask, but no way.
Is this the Pearland Nature Park?
Yeah, so if you're looking, that's what it's called, like on eBird, the hotspot is Pearland Nature Park.
So they aren't going to pave it over with apartments?
No, that's not the plan. No, whenever I brought this project to my supervisors, they were all really excited about it because they hear a lot of this stuff about prairie work going on, but they haven't necessarily had anyone that really got what that meant, and so they're all actually pretty excited about this project.
Okay, maybe it's a stupid question, but you gotta run a walkway. Where is that?
So there is a trail so there's a little parking lot right here, and there's
I'm familiar with the park.
the trail that goes.
I'm familiar with the park.
Okay, so what was?
You're going to be developing wetlands, but you're going to run not a trail, or a boardwalk. Where is that, so that people can actually see the wetlands?
So it splits through the wetlands. Right now the trail goes, so this is the wetland areas right here. And the trail goes through it and it comes down here and there's a loop, and right now it just turns around and comes back. But there's actually, if you go out there now, it actually looks kind of bad because the drainage district is clearing off a lot of the creek, but they're also putting in a trail that's going to connect down to Kirby through there. Yeah.
Was there any wetlands before the park was created? I remember, I think that.
Yeah,
was
you can,
Westland.
and you can see a lot of that. That's what a lot of these different shades are. It's probably depressions through here. So yeah, they created wetlands over wetlands, but probably. But a lot of times once people start farming it, they do try to level the land as much as they can, so a lot of those features start getting filled in.
They used to do some rice farming out there, I think some soybeans.
Yeah, and that's what I would imagine these levees are mostly from rice farming. Yeah. So getting ready for seeding this fall, hopefully, and this is where actually another partnership comes into play. I was out at the Nash Prairie actually hand picking seed for this project, and some of y'all may know Susan Conity. And she said, hey, you know, why don't you contact the Nature Conservancy? They have a big machine that comes out here and collects seed. They may be willing to donate some for your project. And so I, you know, contacted them, and they came out, and I showed them what I was wanting to do out there, and they were like, yeah, we'd be happy to donate seed for it. So that was another big cost savings for us on this work. I did get a small greenhouse. I know John's back there like, oh, you got a greenhouse. You know, it's not as fancy as what you're going to see from City of Houston, but we do have the ability to grow plants. You know, public outreach and the community involvement is really important to the Parks Department, so we want to be able to get the community involved through doing some plantings and stuff out there. I'm going to try and do it a little bit different here than kind of what other projects have done in this area. Usually, you know, we grow them in seed trays, and then we go to 1-gallon pots, and the idea that we have a more mature plant, a bigger plant that goes to the field, so you get a better survival out of them. I just don't have the space to be able to do that here. So what I'm going to try and do is grow them in the deep cell trays, so it's like a deep plug basically, with the idea that I may not get as good as survival as I would have going to the 1 gallons, but I can grow them and plant them a lot faster than I would if I was doing it that way. And so I am going to try to do some type of study, survey, basically to see how successful they actually are out in the field. Here's kind of a list of what I've hand collected this past year. Most of the grasses and forbs were for the Prairie project. And then the wetland stuff is just to add some more diversity to the wetlands out there. And the button bush, I'll talk about why I collected that in a little bit. So that's kind of the nature trail project, what I got going on out there right now. And so I mentioned, you know, we only have 2 parks that are kind of natural areas in Pearland. So trying to look at, well, how can we do other things that's beneficial for our native plants, our native wildlife? So there are opportunities out there. And one example I'm showing people in our city is we have this retention pond off of Magnolia. And, you know, same thing, you got the houses back there, the stormwater, you know, drains into this retention pond. But this one was designed a little bit different than a lot of the other ones. It holds shallow water, and it has a gradual slope. So that allowed a lot of these plants to grow in it. And this pond actually has a lot of really good native stuff growing in it. There's a lot of pondweeds and Sagittarius and Eleocris, all that stuff. But it's always covered in birds too when you go by there. And right now in the wintertime, it's full of waterfowl, so it's been a really cool thing. So that's what I'm pushing our city to try and do more of these type of retention ponds. And you know, they're definitely open to it. I had a meeting with our engineers about 2 months ago, I guess. And so we're trying to figure out how we can make some of this stuff work for some of our developments. So this is the other, I'll call it nature park, because it's a little bit different, you know, more man-made. And really it's these large retention ponds. It's about 70 acres total, this whole area. But there's actually some really cool features about it. One thing that we did actually about 4 years ago, I actually worked for the Texas Coastal Watershed Program at that time, and they have a stormwater wetland program. Some of y'all may know Mary Edwards. And so I was actually working for her at the time, and we actually installed these floating wetlands out there. And so what they are, these ponds have I don't know if you can see in that picture, but there's a concrete retaining wall that goes all the way around these ponds, and it's just a straight drop off of about 2 or 3 feet into the water. So it's not great for growing wetland plants. So the idea is these mats float on the water, and they have holes that you can put the plants on, and the roots will grow down into the water and help filter out all the water before it goes into Mary's Creek right there on the north side of it. It's also been the plants look kind of sad in this picture because sometimes when you go by there, there'll be like 50 white pelicans all out there stomping them all down. So I'm actually planning to do some vegetation buffers out there as well. I want to do grass buffers all the way around the slopes of the ponds. So it may help with water quality a little bit, but as well as provide habitat for some of the wildlife. We actually do get a pretty good diversity of birds out there. I don't know if some of y'all are birders in here, I know. And then there's one of the buildings up there is actually a water treatment facility, so we want to do some more tree and shrub buffers there to kind of help make you feel like you're a little bit more in nature. But whenever they created this site, they left a couple of islands out there, and so those islands grew up in tallow trees. But in this case, the tallow trees have been pretty useful. There's actually a nesting colony of herons and egrets and spoonbills out there. So the long island on the left pond is where most of the trees are, and that's where most of the birds are. And then on the right pond, the little small one up there has a little corner of tallows. And so I'm working on some plans to do, to try and treat it with more native trees. And then also that's where I collected the buttonbush for. I talked about the buttonbush. So there's not a concrete wall that goes around these islands. So there is a slope there, but they're eroding pretty bad. So I want to grow buttonbush to be able to plant right there on the edge, something that can tolerate that water, as well as provide structure for the birds to nest in. So,
Oh, you want? Okay. So I have 5 prairie restoration sites and 2 riparian restoration sites, and this is a map that shows where they are in relation to the city. Just to give you an idea, they're pretty spread out, and most of them are on the east side. This is Clinton Park, and this was our first prairie restoration site, and this is about 10 acres. And this one was just mowed parkland, and we came in and asked the Parks Department we came in and asked the Parks Department if we could, do a prairie on this site, and it took 10 acres out of their mowing cycle, so it was beneficial for them, and they weren't really sure about it, but this site's done really well. You can see that there's natural drainage features in that. It was never filled, and we came in and it was just, the lawn grass, the mowed lawn grass, which is really tough, and it still has a lot of Dallas grass in it, so we're constantly battling that. But we came in initially and we sprayed it, and then we seeded it, we did soil amendments, and we've had 2 planting events out there, community planting events. And the eastern side of the park now is really extremely thick little blue stem and yellow Indian grass right now. So, and that's a sort of a higher, the western side is a little wetter, and so things haven't established as well, because sometimes it's just standing water under there. But I think that's where we've done a lot of our plantings, and so those plants are already established and they're able to do well in those wet conditions. And so this site's doing really well. And this is Hobart Taylor Park, and this is 7 acres, and this was the same situation, same grant. We took out 7 acres out of the mowing, and this site was fill material. So when we seeded it and everything like that, and removed the vegetation initially, and then we had our first planting event out there, and everyone started digging, and they were digging up oyster shell and glass, and this is our toughest site for sure. And but in the seeds, some of the seeds have done okay out there. There's still a lot of Dallas grass that it's competing with, but our plants are doing great. The native plants, the native grasses and forbs we're putting in there look fantastic. So the ones we're planting are making it, and they look great. And we had some soil amendments done out there, and I think that helped, especially since this was fill. This is Robert C. Stewart Park, and this one's on the south side of town. And before the Natural Resources Management Program was established, which was a little over 4 years ago, there was a group that decided they wanted to take on this park and make it a natural area, and they had some funding, and they did some restoration, but there wasn't a natural resources program to maintain it, and so it's just been grown up with woody invasives, and you can still see some of the blue stems coming up underneath. And I really like our forested site compared to the 2 I just showed you, which were just mowed parkland. These that we have that are covered in trees are, to me, much easier, because a lot of the native herbaceous vegetation is still there. And so we just remove the woody species, and that seed bank is there, and some of the grasses are still there, and forbs are still there. So it's not a huge competition with some of these invasive grasses because the native stuff is still there. And this is one of those instances. And so for this one, it's along Sims Bayou, and I have a riparian edge and a forested buffer, and I have management units on this one. And the reason I have separate management units, which I do this one a little bit differently than the other ones, because there's really good wildlife here already. So I don't want to come in and clear and do prairie and clear out all the habitat for them. So where I have unit 3, that was mowed park, and so that was just a mowed area, and I'm struggling with invasives there. But we had a planting event there last year, and so we really planted that very heavily, and it's looking good. And then I've targeted unit 1 for this year, and that's covered in woody species. So we have some funding. We've got crews coming out there to remove just that unit, and we'll leave the other sections for the wildlife. There's just a million rabbits out there, but it's really good for birds. This is a great birding park. And so there's, we're going to leave some of the native trees that are out there in certain areas, especially along the bayou. It's more of a savanna area closer to that, and so we're definitely going to leave some of that. And that was 25 acres. This is Black Hawk Park.
I couldn't read what the name of that other park was.
This is Robert C. Stewart Park. And this is a 25-acre park. And this is really just natural area. There's no amenities at this park. There's no restrooms. There's, yes.
Approximately where is this located? City of Houston is pretty big.
Yes. That's this one right here.
I can't see the map.
Yeah, what is that?
It's just south of 610, west of 45.
It's on the west side. It's near Hobby Airport.
It's north of Hobby. So we just got funding for Black Hawk Park, and that's a 47-acre park, and we're doing prairie restoration there. So we've got a contractor out to come and clear out. It's just stands of glossy privet and Chinese tallow out there. That's mainly what the species that's out there, and but there's a lot of native herbaceous stuff under that too. So we're just going to clear out that, and we have money to seed it, and so right now I have funding to do about that southern portion of it, and you can see the west, the southwestern portion is park, and there's ball fields and restrooms on that. And then I just a couple of weeks ago found out I got funding for Silver Rodriguez Park for phase 1. I have this divided into 4 phases, and so phase 1 is funded to remove, and this is almost exclusively Chinese tallow, to remove 14 acres of that to do prairie habitat, and there's a boardwalk going in, and we put interpretive signage in all our sites, and so that was included in this. And this was historic prairie. In the historic aerials, you could see the potholes, and so I was looking at historic aerials, and initially whenever I came on, we're still in the inventory phase, see what we have, to see what we're going to do, and I was looking at this park, the historic, and I could see these great, prairie potholes out there. And whenever I went out to the site to look at it, I walked into all of them. They were all still there. And actually, we came back to do a wetland delineation there to try and promote, how important this site was to the Parks Department. And as we were doing the wetland delineation, there were 2 mottled ducks swimming in one of the potholes. And that just happened to be because half of the pothole was being mowed by the Parks Department, and the other half was forested. And so the little section that was mowed, mottled ducks were using that. So I think this restoration is going to be great, and there's really just a ton of different species, herbaceous native species here. And so I think we'll see what happens whenever we remove the tallow, but I think this is going to be a good one. And then our riparian restoration sites. This is Milby Park, and we got funding through TCEQ, and the funding was to clean the water that's coming off of Milby Park. So this is Sims Bayou, and it doesn't meet for bacteria and some other things. And so We did a 100-foot buffer along the edge of the park, which this was a really interesting restoration project because it was almost completely cleared. There was no trees there initially, so it was really an opportunity to create not just restore, but just create it. It wasn't there at all. And so we put in over 2,000 trees along this border. It's about 6 acres. And they're spaced at 10-foot centers. And we have 2 interns designated just for this project. And there's monthly volunteer days for this. We do a lot of research on this one just because we started out with a blank slate, so it was really easy to kind of monitor our methods for riparian restoration on this, and I'll talk a little bit about that. White Oak Parkway is our other riparian restoration site, and we went in with Houston Audubon and Student Conservation Association on a grant for this one to do a bird-friendly community. It was a pilot project for Houston Audubon, and we selected this 10-acre section in purple. And most of the trees and understory here are non-native. There's a little bit of native stuff in here. So this is different than Milby Park, which we started with nothing. To this is that we're having to come in and chainsaw these trees and remove them and put in native trees. So really 2 very different riparian restorations. And this is our list of species, and I was lucky to have 4 interns this year during the fall, and so we just went and collected seed from many remnant prairies in the area and restored prairies. So we just went out when we could and got as much seed as we can.
Kind of surprised no one called me out either on my plant list. I had it all in order by common names. I was figuring it probably drove some of y'all crazy seeing that. Yeah. So we do currently offer a monthly volunteer work day. So it's called the Natural Resources Volunteer Work Day. So right now it's the first Thursday of every month with the idea that we try and tackle a different project in Pearland, doing different natural resource projects. I would guess once we get going a little bit more on the restoration work, we'll probably be doing more out there, more plantings and stuff like that. I was talking about the floating wetlands earlier, that picture on the left. So someone had asked about Harvey. That was probably the biggest issue I would say I had. Our wetlands, they have an anchor that goes driven into the bottom of the pond, and it's just a cable that attaches to the mats. And so it goes up and down with the water as it fluctuates. Well, this was completely full, so it pulled the anchors out of the ground, took them to the other side of the pond, and then once the water would drop back down, it left them at the very top of the levee. So it was a real job to get all those back down and back in place. Out there at the John Hargrove Environmental Complex, JHEC, we also have a Monarch Way station, and we offer pollinator work days, and mostly it's because we don't want to use pesticides in our pollinator gardens, so it's a lot of hand weeding and upkeep with that. And then we get a lot of requests from scouts for different projects, so we try to work with them when they like to do plantings and things like that.
Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts?
Both. Usually it's more the Eagle Scouts I get requests from, but I've had a few of the Girl Scouts also.
So we have a regular volunteer day. It's the second and fourth Thursday of the month, and we just have great volunteers. They do a great job, and I see some of you in here today. And so really, recently we've just had trouble keeping up with the volunteers. They just get our plants out so fast, which we love that because we have so many restoration sites. And so we do seeding, and then we bump our 4-inch pots into 1-gallon pots. And we're able to use the Houston Parks greenhouse, which a horticulture that is over that greenhouse, but they allow us to have our plants there. And so we have 2 rows of tables inside the greenhouse, and then they let us use some tables in the lath house. And we have outgrown the laugh house at least. And so they have given us a maintenance facility in Clear Lake to hold our plants. And since we have Sylvan Rodriguez Park, which is down in Clear Lake, and that one's 72 acres. I don't know if I said that before. So that's a huge one total. And so we'll need a lot of plants for that. And Black Hawk's 47, and that's down in that area too. So we're going to hold a lot of our plants in Clear Lake just because we've outgrown this area here. But normally, I was looking at some of our volunteer data. They're bumping up between like 500 and 800 one-gallon pots per workday. So it's really amazing. Yes.
What time is that in the morning?
Yes, it's from 9 to noon. Mm-hmm. And really, I mean, that's how we're able to, these great volunteers are how we're able to have plants for our restoration sites. I don't know what we'd do if we didn't. So our volunteer program is very essential to our restoration. And then we have planting events to get the plants in the ground. And this isn't as efficient as our volunteer propagation program, just trying to get volunteers to come out and plant. And, you know, it's hard work. We've reached out to universities and just community members, and we had pretty good turnout. Clinton Park, which was our first restoration site, we're going to continue planting there every year just to increase the diversity and get some of these native plants established there. So that one always does well because it was our first one, and people just come back and they want to see how it did. Now that we're expanding, we may be having too many offerings of planting events because people are spreading themselves out. But you know, we usually have our planting events in the fall. I'm going to try and have some next spring so we can space it out, and that'll help us get some of our plants out of the laugh house because we're just running out of room. And the planting events, they help us meet our match on our grants because there's all these volunteer hours, and also our volunteers in our greenhouse help us to do that too. This year with the Black Hawk grant, I put in an invasive species removal event. So we haven't done that before. It's a community event to remove invasives, and we'll see how that goes. But initially what we're going to do is train the community how to identify species, and Black Hawk Park is a good one because really it just has Chinese tallow and glossy privet. So we can just train on those two species. If you see one of these, remove it. And then we have a crew associated with that, so the crew will lead the community members in removing these invasives. And then we also get Eagle Scout projects that they do chimney swift towers and bat houses and stuff for us.
So education, that's also a big part of the Natural Resource Division. We have coming up there, this is at the JHEC site. The city is actually in the process of building a nature center there. It's about a 5,000 square foot building, and then it has another 2,000 square foot pavilion on it. But it'll have, you know, a 50-seat classroom. That's where my office will be, and then there's like a great room with educational displays and that sort of stuff. I mentioned another part of our division is we have an outdoor recreation programmer, and through that we have birding workshops, and our new birding instructor is actually here today. So he said, make sure to plug it. So we do offer beginning birding classes for those that are interested, like how do I get started in learning, you know, if I see a bird, how do I try to figure out what this is? And there's a little bit more advanced classes getting into some of the species stuff. And then we also teach nature-based classes to at our city summer camps. I'll let you talk about it.
So there's not an education person within our natural resources program. Our recreation department has educators that go to community centers and they do some environmental education. They take kids to the ponds, fishing and things like that. Usually for us, environmental education is done through our interns that we get through grants. And right now we have 2 interns that are going out to community centers 4 times a month and doing environmental education. And a lot of that is through our partnership with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And we initially started a grant with that. And that was Clinton and Hobart Taylor Parks, the first mowed parks that we had. And those were tied to wildlife refuges. And so and they both have community centers, so the kids would go to the community center and be taught by the interns, and then they would take a trip once a year to the wildlife refuge and sort of relate the local prairie habitat to one at a big wildlife refuge and just see the differences in the wildlife and that. And a lot of these kids in the community centers don't get a chance to go out to the actual wildlife refuges, so it's just relating that. And then we do workshops with our program. We've done a plant propagation workshop, milkweed workshop. We did some plant identification workshops. And then we have the National Wildlife Federation Community Wildlife Habitat, and so we promote that at events for people if they want to do native habitat in their yards, that they can register through NWF and then help the city to obtain the National Wildlife Certification, which we have obtained, and we just have to do certain things every year to be considered a community wildlife habitat. And I'm the compiler on the Central Houston Christmas bird count every year, and so that's a volunteer program too, where people can join, and for one day we have we have our area divided into sections and then just go birding, and that's a really fun day.
Kind of the other member of our natural resources team is our urban forester. And he actually deals a lot with development because Pearland is a really growing city. But in that, our city does have ordinances to try and help protect and preserve some of our natural features. So we do have a protected tree list. And so basically it says any tree that's over 12 inches that's one of these species is considered a protected tree. And so what that means, if a developer wants to remove one of these trees, they either have to make up for it through mitigation, which means they can plant extra trees to make up for the ones that they removed, or there's a fee that's associated with it that goes into a fund that's dedicated for doing enhancement projects in the community. And really the intent of this ordinance is to try and encourage better site planning on developments, so we're not just clear cutting everything. And it's actually, there's been several cases where it really has worked. There's a Dairy Queen that just went in Pearland that they had 3 live oaks that were all over, I think they were between 42 to 48 inches, every one of them. And so, they would have just removed all of those trees, but because of the cost of it, they wound up reworking their parking lot and saving all of them. So, the city also, mostly it's through the engineering departments who started it, the stormwater management program. So they developed a plan that was submitted to TCEQ. And that was done in 2014. So I'm also on the committee for that, with the idea to try and, there's different components, but educating the public is a part of it about, ways to reduce, your pollution that's going into our creeks and that sort of thing. But then we also try to do other projects to help with our stormwater quality.
So I mentioned that forestry is not part of natural resources, but our forestry department does do the tree mitigation also. For natural resources, we have a natural area ordinance, which allows people to have native vegetation over the required height for the rest of that the city requires. So if neighborhood protection comes out to your house and says your grass is too high, but it's native grass and you want it to be high, you can apply for a natural area permit. And we can issue you that so that, and this was just developed so that you could have native plants, that, people that want to have the option to have pollinator gardens in their yard or just a little native patch can do so. Yes?
Yeah, I just want to say that ordinance was not something that the city of Houston just said, oh, let's do this. Katie, Indy, and Katie, who was the teacher in Heights? There was lawsuits about that.
Kelly Walker.
Pardon?
Kelly Walker.
Kelly Walker, yes. And as a consequence of that, the city of Houston finally came around to recognizing that. So, it's been a long time coming, but it's good that they're now recognizing that. But it was the impetus for that was really this chapter right here, to get that done.
Well, good for you. Yeah, it's great. And and we go out to people's houses and they have great intentions. They just want to have native plants. And the city is fine with that. We just have to we come out and, we do a report, we send it to neighborhood protection so that they won't get a violation. And it's that easy.
Is it possible to do that in Pearland at any point?
Possible, yeah. It hasn't come up yet. I haven't actually had any issues yet where people have said, the city's regulating their lawns that way. So it may come up in the future, but I haven't had any issues with that yet.
And this doesn't replace what your HOA would say, so we can't overrule that, but just in general. And the Natural Resources Program also consults on some development projects and comments on species used and things like that.
So just put in some other random stuff that we also do in Pearland, some of the fun stuff. So I went ahead and showed our rookery there at JHEC. And so this is kind of the breakdown. I registered it as part of the Texas Colonial Waterbird Survey last year. And so we had over 200 nests on these between the islands. This is a picture of the smaller one with the tallow on the little corner there. And so I think we had 9 species that were using the islands. And we try to improve things for people to get out and fish. So we do stock it. It's just a partnership with Parks and Wildlife. So I think we put about 1,100 catfish in that pond this year.
That's still the Roberts?
Yes, right behind the recycling center. Mm-hmm. And we also did a 1-acre wildflower area there at JHEC. The Pearland has been doing wildflower projects since 2013, but I've always been told they haven't been very successful. I'm guessing they probably were picking sites that were too weedy or not doing the proper site prep for it or what, but I've already seen little babies popping up, so hopefully they'll do well.
So for our research, this is Milby Park right here where we had the area that was riparian that didn't have many trees. There were patches where there were a couple of big post oaks, but we decided to do some research here. So for the herbaceous vegetation, which was all non-native, it was full of guinea grass actually. And so we thought that we would do different plots to see what the best methods for controlling these in riparian areas are. So we did one section where we did tilling. We did one that was mowed. We spread mats on one. We did one with nothing. And just to see, and we did the middle one as the herbicide section, and we did half-acre sections. So each section we had 2 treatments. So we had 2 herbicide sections, 2 mat sections, and a total of 12, 6 different treatment methods. And right now we're just monitoring the vegetation at those sites monthly to see the changes in the species based on those different treatment methods. And this is our vegetation plots that we have on that. And we're starting to do vegetation surveys on all our restoration sites just to show the change before restoration, during restoration, and then after restoration. So we're setting up vegetation plots through all of our restoration sites. We do wildlife surveys. We do bird surveys associated with our restoration sites also. We just have points that we've randomly selected on GIS that we visit. Yes?
Are you planning to do anything with the City Nature Challenge in April?
Mm-hmm. We have our White Oak Restoration Project. That Saturday is our monthly work day, so we're going to have the crew out doing the monitoring the iNaturalist and all the vegetation and wildlife that we see there, and that's a really good birding area. So we should get a lot of good stuff there. So we'll definitely be doing that on that Saturday, and then probably my interns and I will be doing it for the other days. We do deer surveys at Lake Houston Wilderness Park. That one's almost 5,000 acres, and there's a pretty good population of deer there. So we monitor that every year to see if they're in need of management. That's up near Kingwood. It's like past Kingwood, actually. So, and that's a pretty big one. And Texas Parks and Wildlife used to own that one, and so that was managed really well before. And they did deer surveys, and we sort of worked with them on the methods for that to make sure that we could maintain that well. And we do frog surveys at Silver Rodriguez Park, the 72-acre one in Clear Lake, because of the potholes. And we were actually out there doing a frog survey one night, and it was really dry, so we weren't hearing, and we do them by sound, and so we weren't hearing that much, and we walked into the biggest pothole, which is in the back of the park, and it was dry, and there were huge cracks in it. And as we're standing there, you know, there's all these things, we have little flashlights, and there's all these things moving, and we shine the flashlights down, and there was thousands of leopard frogs coming up out of the cracks. It's really a really interesting site. So we've decided to include amphibians on that site, because I think we could show some changes in that also. And then we're in charge of lake management too. We work with Parks and Wildlife to stock the lakes with fish, and we also do some vegetation management. There's hydrilla problems in some of them, and water hyacinth, and so we work to control that too. And then we also have the wildflower, Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower event every year that we work with the Houston Parks Board to do that. If anyone has any questions.